Since I've came to a decision to review this episode Girls Gone Wild from the Powerpuff Girls, I need to remind anyone who calls out on me not watching the Powerpuff Girls that much. When I watch this episode for the first time and know that it's one of the worst episodes from the show, I don't really need to watch the show because not only I'm fully familiar with it, but I can instantly tell that I don't really need to watch the show to understand how poorly executed this episode is. And the knowledge I have involving the later seasons of the original Powerpuff Girls is that some of the people moved on to Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends, which explains we ended up having episodes like this and Sun Screamed that I talked about in Cartoon Crisis 2. I'm just gonna say this right now that you will probably expect me to express the inconsistencies of how this episode is made, especially since that the movie is a prequel to the show. But judging of how this episode is really trying so hard to showcase the whole parents being extremely concerned, all the while just trying to make sure that kids don't imitate their favorite superheroes. This episode would have happened in seasons 1 or 2, because as far as I'm concerned, Stanley and his wife are being part of an organization of suing the Powerpuff Girls or Professor Lutonium just to make sure that the entire city of Townsville is back to normal. I'm going to assume that these characters will have been better off in the movie, because as far as I'm concerned, it will have made the motivations a lot more better, and the fact that this is happening in seasons 5, I just honestly think that they are basically nothing more than tours, and I haven't even scratched the surface of how the characters were portrayed in the final minutes of this episode. I need to be perfectly clear with you. I know I'm fully aware that Townsville has been in some serious jeopardy when it comes to the cast of antagonists in the show. My only gripe with it is mainly the fact that even before Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends came out, this episode honestly doesn't take anything seriously when it has the idea of preventing superheroes from completely having terrible influences towards children. Like, the fact that the Powerpuff Girls are technically children, and the fact that it's weird for the Powerpuff Girls to be handicapped in this scenario, it really makes the handicap from city of Brownsville honestly a lot more weirder, considering that they were moved to a different location. And even if I did not enjoy that episode and it was a waste of time, I can understand that the environment in that episode was a lot more different than this. Since the Powerpuff Girls can't use their superpowers against crime, they resort on calling people on the phone, all the while the burglar is taking his time and just becoming superior without anyone getting in his way, mainly the Powerpuff Girls. The issues with this episode is that it drags scenes out for way too long, which is similar to Sunscream, especially the bits where the Powerpuff Girls are slowly walking due to them having Sunscream. All the while the cops are mainly just filling up the one time, because as far as I'm concerned, it really feels like that this episode is showing us what the cops would do in this scenario, which does revolve real life, but at the same time it does nothing while the cops aren't being very professional when it comes to taking anything seriously, especially since that Blossom is trying to call them. It just really feels like that the pacing of this episode is somewhat the inspiration of SpongeBob writers from the post-movie era took. I mean, granted, I'm not sure if that's really the case, but judging of how the pacing of this episode is really, really annoying. Nothing exciting happens. Like, if I'm gonna be really honest with you, with the Powerpuff Girls not doing much in this episode, all I can think of is, what's the point of watching this episode? You're not doing a good example of showcasing what parents are protecting their children from getting instantly influenced by people like the Powerpuff Girls. Getting back to Stanley and his wife, all I can think of is mainly of how that was supposed to be against these characters, because they are always proven to be wrong this entire time, which is something that I do not like when it comes to that type of overweighted cliche. They instantly just expect us to see these characters on being wrong, while the characters like the Powerpuff Girls to be right. Whenever I think about that cliche, it just instantly makes the entire episode cringe-worthy to sit through, because you instantly know what's going to happen and see these characters being proven wrong. Like, if that's literally the motivation, then it's really difficult to see these characters as actual characters, even though that these characters are supposed to be a representation on to make sure that their kids don't get terribly influenced. If anything, it really makes it a lot more dreadful to see this episode, to understand the other side of the story where they're not being fleshed out. And when the episode is showcasing one of the antagonists, the Dukes of Doom, terrorizing the neighborhood, it really feels like that this episode is trying way too hard on this cliche that it's just becoming a lot more exhausting than irritating. And believe me when I say this, Sam and Cat did an episode involving this cliche, Blue Dog Soda, and for me personally, with this information coming from this episode that came out 10 years prior to that episode, just goes to show that this cliche seriously needs to go away. Like, completely being sued literally. Like, granted, it may be a weird way to sue something involving the cliche, but at the same time, it's a better execution for something than anything that what this episode is trying to do. Like, does the final minutes of this episode feel satisfying to you? Well, Stanley and his wife completely destroy any means of suing or contracts or anything involving the Powerpuff Girls, unable to use their powers while the Powerpuff Girls save the day, all the while the narrator does its stick of saying that the Powerpuff Girls save the day as usual. Because let me tell you, I really felt that anything involving the Powerpuff Girls in this episode doesn't really make anything up. Not only that that the majority of the episode ends up becoming pointless because of the ending, it really feels like that this entire meaning of badly influencing children doesn't really mean much, because we barely see any of that throughout the entire episode. Not to mention the fact that the Powerpuff Girls are in school with the same children. Granted, I can understand it may be difficult for Stanley and his wife to understand, but at the same time, I just don't think that they're that dumb enough to understand what Townsville feels when the Powerpuff Girls save the day, especially with the movie showcasing of what the Powerpuff Girls' powers cause a lot of severe damage in the city. If you ask me, the more I think about it, the news people or anything else that witnessed the damages in the movie have more of a reason to go against the Powerpuff Girls than the two characters that can't be able to think straight, all the while just join this organization on just suing the Powerpuff Girls without even looking what's really important involving the Powerpuff Girls. As far as I'm concerned, one of the reasons why I don't take this episode as seriously as much people do is the fact that it's so dumbed down. Like, if an episode is so dumbed down that it's difficult to understand the meanings of what the Powerpuff Girls is all about, then all I can think of is there's literally no point to continue on with the show. Like, as much as I do not watch much of this show compared to other Powerpuff Girl fans, I can instantly tell of what the show is all about, since that I can understand the formula of what Powerpuff Girls is. They mainly save the town or Townsville, they completely stop bad guys, and whenever they're tackling some serious obstacles, they find some scenarios to face off the obstacles. And believe me, when they're dumbed down in an episode like this, all I can think of is that it's really difficult to take anything seriously involving the Powerpuff Girls. Like, with this being part of seasonal watch, then it's pretty much a good thing that the original ended up ending before it got worse. And when it comes to the reboot, I'm pretty sure that I'm gonna go back to that reboot after talking about it since Christmas of last year. But as long as I have other alternatives involving Cartoon Crisis 3, it's gonna take a while for me to get to the reboot. Bottom line, this episode alone is really boring to sit through, and in my opinion, one of the worst Powerpuff Girls I've ever seen. Granted, it's not saying much since I didn't watch more of this show, but when I have knowledge, then Stanley and his wife, which I'm fully aware she has a name, but I can't spell her right, it really shows that I can instantly understand the meaning of what the Powerpuff Girls is, rather than two adults who only appear in this episode only. I'm giving this episode a 3 out of 10.